Let me begin by paying obeisance to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, to whom we owe our existence, to whom we owe his leadership and far-sighted vision, without whom we would not be where we are today. I also like to express our solidarity with the Tibetans inside Tibet, who on a daily basis go through tremendous mental and physical stress imposed by the Chinese leadership. And I also pay my respect to Sikyong Penpa Tsering, who is present here, who has joined us in our effort to bring the plight of the Panchen Rinpoche, who has been under incarceration since he was 6 years old. For the last 26 years, we still don't know where he is. We still don't know whether he is alive or not. And therefore, Rinpoche's presence here is an important signal where even the abbot of the Dashidumbu monastery has to be involved in the release of the Panchen Lama or have some information about the status of the Panchen Rinpoche. We have been approaching the United Nations since 1950, at a time when many countries around the world were gaining independence. We came under the occupation of China. We also approached the United Nations in 1959, 1961, and 1965. There have been resolutions that were not implemented, just adopted. Therefore, we have many Tibetans, there are many Tibetans, and I think it's not just the Tibetans, but people around the world who feel that United Nations is a human body without hands and legs to implement what they have adopted. We also have this feeling that United Nations is in fact becoming more undemocratic in its functioning. It's the veto power of the Security Council is undemocratic. Ironically, India was the one who proposed China to be a member of the United Nations. But today, when you talk about the expansion of the Security Council, China is the first one to oppose India's inclusion into the expanded Security Council. We have also been approaching the UNHCR for a very long time, but to no avail. Therefore, we feel that United Nations is also unequal in many ways. People who are incarcerated, people who are suppressed, have no space for representation. In fact, the state-sponsored suppression on people, the states are represented in the United Nations. The suppressed people have no space to express their grievances to the world community. Therefore, I come here with a lot of skepticism and also with a heavy heart as to whether anybody is really listening to the plight of the Tibetans, to the plight of the Uyghurs, to the plight of the Hong Kongers, those who are suffering in the hands of the Communist China, but also many other people who also face similar fate around the world. 155 Tibetans have self-immolated so far. Why do people self-immolate? None of these 155 people have killed any Tibetan or taken violence against any Chinese or killed any Chinese or taken up violence against the communist regime. Why are these people killing themselves, self-immolating themselves? Of course, there is a very thin line between violence and non-violence. Here, motivation matters. We have not hurt any Chinese. All these 155 people burned themselves to death in the hope against hope that the Chinese government will pay attention to their plight and resolve the Tibetan issue. In the hope against hope that the international community will pay some attention to the plight of the Tibetans. There was a time in Vietnam when one monk self-immolated and sparked international attention. But today, when 155 Tibetans self-immolate, the world watches, just watches, with no concrete action. And it's a very sad situation. That is why I say I come here with a heavy heart and with a lot of skepticism. It is at the convenience of the governments or the United Nations. When they feel like, they consider us a state. When they don't feel like, they don't consider us a state. Therefore, at the presence of our chief guest, Vice President of the Czech Senate, Honorable Jerry Oberpfalzer, here, and the presence of special guest, Honorable Nicholas Walker, a Member of Parliament of Switzerland, and the presence of Senator André Gattolin, Senator of the French Parliament, and our special guest, Deputy Mayor Gelencia Ferenczi, here, and all the panelists, experts, my colleagues from Central Tibetan Administration, Tibetan youths from around the world, different organizations like International Campaign for Tibet, is a source of encouragement for us. I appreciate your courage, your determination in expressing your solidarity with the Tibetans, with the Uyghurs, with the Hong Kongers, with the South Mongolians, and even now today, the threat that China imposes on Taiwan. I also express my solidarity with our friends, brothers and sisters in Taiwan. There was a time a few years ago when I was in Lithuania, maybe about a decade ago in Lithuania, I was talking with a friend, a political leader in Lithuania, and we were talking about Tibetan history. I explained to him about the glorious days of Tibet, the 3 centuries, from 7th to 9th century, when Tibet invaded the capital of China, Xi'an, and expanded its territory up to Samarkand in today's Uzbekistan. I talked about the 400 years of disintegration of Tibet. I talked about a little more than 100 years of the Sakya rule, or the Sakya hegemony in Tibet, and the Mongolian influence on Tibet, not rule by Mongolians. I also talked about the 100 years of Pamodruba hegemony, the dynasty. I also talked about the 100 years of Rinpopa's history. I also talked about 100 years of Deba-Tsangpa's rule in Tibet. And then we also discussed about the rule of Tibet since the 5th Dalai Lama to the 14th Dalai Lama. And then that person told me that if you look at the Tibetan history, I think you have more right to be independent than Lithuania, because Lithuania also has gone through a lot throughout their history. But considering the history of Lithuania, I'm sure that can be comparable to many countries in the world, that Tibet was independent state. And we have Michael Van Wal Prague, who had been studying this issue for a very long time. He had written about this, the legal status of Tibet. And more recently, in the last, as far as I know, he had spent about 7 years studying the history of not just Tibet, but of the whole region, and made it very clear that Tibet was an independent country. We also have a Chinese friend, Professor Lau, who now lives in San Diego, who published a book, a historical book, mentioning that whether it was the Mongolian Yuan or the Chinese Qing or the Manchu, they have never in their historical records considered Tibet as part of China. And we all know, since the 13th Dalai Lama's return to Tibet, Tibet was never a part of China. It became a part of China only in 1951, when we were forced to sign the 17-point agreement under duress, under the threat of war. Only then did we become part of China. We tried to live under the 17-point agreement for 8 long years. His Holiness also became part of the preparatory committee for Tibet Autonomous Region. But China trampled. China went against all the provisions of the 17-point agreement, which was eventually abrogated by the Tibetans when we came into exile in 1959. I will not go into detail of the present situation inside Tibet, because there are many subjects that will be discussed in these 2 days, categorically, and more particularly on the status of Panchen Rinpoche, which we'll be taking up this afternoon. And there are a host of panelists who will be covering all these subjects, so I shall not dwell on this, even though my office had prepared a very thorough statement on this, and I'm deviating from my official speech to make this extempore, considering the situation here. The situation inside Tibet, just to give you an overview of what is going on. In terms of language, during Mao's time, Tibetan language is used more as a tool of propaganda. Then there was a period, then we went through the Cultural Revolution. There was a period when Tibet had little freedom, when Hu Yaobang visited Tibet and sent back many Chinese back to China. Within this short period, the Tibetans experienced freedom. Tibetans managed to learn Little Tibetan. Tibetans managed to resume their religious activities. Then again, during Hu Jintao's time, there was martial law in Tibet. And since then, the situation has been deteriorating. And today, during Xi Jinping's time, there is a lot of focus on the common language, which is Mandarin. Schools in Tibet even started teaching Mandarin, Chinese Mandarin. Now they have started teaching Mandarin from Montessori. A few years back, one of my friends who came from Tibet said that the Chinese government had this plan. Why do Tibetans learn Tibetan language? For 2 reasons. One, Tibetan religion, and the second, Tibetan medicine. The Chinese government thought that if they could translate all the religious texts and all the medical texts into Tibetan, then there will be no need for the Tibetans to study Tibetan. In fact, we value our language so much because that is the root of our culture, our religion. At one time in 8th century, we must have had the biggest transliteration in the whole world, because we translated everything in Sanskrit for Buddhist philosophy into Tibetan, and we have preserved that. In that sense, we are an extension of Indian culture. Our language came from India, not China. Our religion also came from India, not China, which China claims today came from China. So the very root of our identity is being extinguished. When you extinguish the Tibetan language, our religion also goes down with it. Our culture also goes down with it. Our way of life also goes down with it. Then there is the more important issue of Tibet's environment. We called ourselves the land surrounded by snow mountain ranges. Early part of last century, Westerners called Tibet the roof of the world. Asians called Tibet as the water tower of Asia. Lately, Chinese environmental scientists call Tibet the third pole because Tibet has the largest amount of glaciers and permafrost that feeds all the rivers, all the major rivers that goes into Pakistan, India, Nepal, Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, and into China. The two most important rivers in China, the Yellow and Yangtze, originate from Tibet. This is not a political issue. So also human rights is also not a political issue. It's a moral issue. Therefore, since COP26 is coming up, it's very important that the world also focuses on the issue of the third pole, the Tibet pole, the largest reservoir of glaciers and permafrost that feeds all these rivers in Asia. So it just does not concern Tibet. It just does not concern China, who has built multiples and multiples of dams across these rivers. But it concerns all the neighboring states. And at large, it concerns the world. Tibet's climatic conditions affects global climate change. And there is no transparency, even though China claims to be leading the fight against climate change. There is no transparency in how China is handling that. China, obviously, is the biggest polluter in the world today. Even today, as China says that they are into renewable energy, they are the biggest polluter. China presumably gives a lot of importance on Tibet's environment because it concerns the future. But at the same time, there is no transparency as to how they are handling the climatic situations inside Tibet. On the other hand, they are removing all the Tibetan nomadic communities from their traditional livelihood to compact communities. We have thousands and thousands of years of experience of having lived on that plateau. We know how to manage the environment. The Tibetan religious tradition also does not allow any action that is detrimental to the climatic conditions or the environment or the ecology of Tibet and its impact on the flora and fauna of Tibet. We have lived in perfect harmony with nature. Only after China came, there was immense deforestation. There was immense relocation of people. The main stakeholders who can be very, very instrumental in preservation and promotion of Tibet's ecology. And we have been deprived to take part in that process, in the preservation and promotion of the Tibetan environment. If you look at, of course, it has just been only 5 months since I came to the office of Sikyong. I'm committed, and our exiled administration is committed to a peaceful, negotiated, lasting solution to the Tibetan issue. A solution that is mutually beneficial, both for the government of China and the people of Tibet, whereby people of Tibet will have the freedom to practice, to use our language, to lead our way of life in a peaceful way. How much ever we wish, we will not be able to lift Tibet out of that. We cannot have another Hanuman to take Tibet out of that place and put it somewhere else. we have to live with the Chinese. China has been talking about harmonious society, both domestically and internationally. But as we know, as we witness, the whole world knows what China says and what China behaves and what China acts are totally two different things. The trade war with the United States, the developing situations with the European Union, China's relations with India, which was an unforced belligerence. Why do China do this? Just before coming here, in the last 1-2 months, I traveled to the Changdang areas of Ladakh, which borders with Tibet. I saw a lot of militarization on both sides. Why do we need spend so much money on militarization? Why do we need to spend so much money on defense? Why can't we spend, both from the Chinese side as well as the Indian side, why do we need to spend so much money on fighting against each other? Why can't we spend that money on economic development? Why can't we spend that money on education of your people? And that was all uncalled for. As we go along the border, I also went to Sikkim this time. As we go along the border, you can see that India's position has always been more defensive. They have not built roads like what China had done on the other side. China's has always been offensive. Why do China do this against India, which was totally uncalled for? Why is China doing all these things in South China Sea? Why is China trying to threaten the invasion of Taiwan? When you talk about harmonious relationship with your neighbors, with the international community, we all expect it. We supported the 2008 Olympics. We supported China's entry into the World Trade Organization. Many of us hoped that China would be a more responsible power. But that has not happened. Therefore, anybody who participates in the 2022 Winter Olympics, we would consider that nation as an accomplice to what China is doing to the national minorities inside China. Domestically, we have seen these huge concentration camps in Uyghur. On an industrial scale, China went against the international norms and agreements when they impose autonomy, the law on autonomy in Hong Kong. I really appreciate the efforts of the young Hong Kongers who resorted only to nonviolence as a means to express their anguish against the Chinese government. And we are also committed to nonviolence as the only means to resolve any conflict, including the Sino-Tibet conflict. Because violence begets more violence. Violence will never ever be a solution to conflicts. Nonviolence is the only means to resolve that. That's why I also stand by our brothers and sisters in Uyghur. I also stand by our brothers and sisters in Hong Kong. I also stand by our brothers and sisters in Southern Mongolia. And I also stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Taiwan. Therefore, we will make every effort to reach out to the Chinese government. If we have to resolve the issues peacefully, then we have to talk. We have to sit. We have to negotiate and find a way that is acceptable to both sides. But till such a lasting resolution is found, we shall not shy away from expressing or to represent our people inside Tibet, to present the reality of the situation inside Tibet, in Uyghur or Hong Kong. We shall not be bound by what China wants us to do. They want us to keep shut. They do not want us to reach out to the international community. They always blame us for internationalizing the Tibetan issue. We are not internationalizing the Tibet issue. In fact, it is the Chinese government who has been doing that. Whenever His Holiness starts traveling, whenever His Holiness meets with a world leader, it is the Chinese government who had always been objecting to that. And because of that, there has been a lot of attention from the international community. So in a way, I also thank the Chinese government for becoming our agent in promotion of the Tibetan issue worldwide. Therefore, in these 2 days, I really hope that the deliberations will be deep, the deliberations will be insightful, and then we'll come out with a declaration that will be used for the purpose that the Geneva Forum, why the Geneva Forum was formed in the first place by my predecessor, Dr. Lobsang Sengye, with the twin objective of bringing prominence to the Tibetan issue when the Universal Periodical Review on China is done early next year, as Kandas Homala said, and then also make sure that the international community play a proactive role in making China accountable in accordance with the rules of human rights. And despite all the heavy-heartedness and the skepticism that I came with, I still hope that the international community will wake up to the reality. There is a sense of realization. I had some unusual guests in Dharamsala whom I thought would never be coming to Dharamsala, but they were countries who are now from Africa, who are now expressing concern about China's activities in their continent. We do receive a lot of communication also from South America, who express their concern about China's initiatives. We all know the string of pearls that China has created in the maritime route all along, from Burma to Sri Lanka to Pakistan, even to Mombasa. They were trying to acquire the port there, and then Greece, Italy, Portugal, all along this maritime Silk Road. I also warn the countries who has accepted to be part of the Yita Yilu, as China say, to be cautious when they take up cooperative work with the Chinese government. And against this backdrop, even despite all the criticism, the skepticism I have, I hope against hope that the international community will wake up. And since we are holding this Geneva Forum in Europe, I hope that Europe will be united in its foreign policy, that Europe will be united in its trade policy. Otherwise, we all know that what former colonial states use against those who were colonized is now being used by China against Europe, one country against another, divide and rule, carrot and stick. If you want to be part of that process, then you are subjugating your freedom to China. Therefore, I appeal to all the countries in Europe to come together unitedly, to have a common foreign policy, to have a common trade policy, not necessarily to downgrade China, but to protect your own values, to protect your freedoms. It's not just enough to have freedom and democracy and human dignity in your own country. You have to work for the people who are suppressed. China today has military power. China today has economic power. China today has political power, but the only power they lack is the moral power. China if it has to be a responsible power, then they have to regain the trust. China, in fact, is the only country who spends more money on internal security than external security. That itself is symptomatic of the fear of the Chinese government. Now, with pressure coming from all around the world, pressure coming from within the country, I fail to understand the position taken by the President Xi Jinping, going back to socialism, clamping down on business, clamping down on personalities. It has just begun. I'm sure there'll be many more coming, and I don't know where it's all going to lead to. I've been trying to think over this over and over again as to why China is doing this. The only thing that comes to my mind is that China is very, very insecure. China fears for their legitimacy. China fears the sustainability of the Communist Party. Therefore, they are doing this. They are keeping these flashpoints burning, whether it's with India, whether it's with Taiwan, whether it's with South China Sea. And if there's a threat to the Communist Party, then they will burn one of these flashpoints and then try to evoke nationalism. And then we don't know what's going to happen. We don't want anarchy in China. We want peace. Therefore, it's time for better sense to prevail over the Chinese leadership and make changes in accordance with the international rules and norms, and to have a good and peaceful transition of China. And that is the best and the only way that China can be redeemed. Its people can gain freedom. Uyghurs can be free, Tibetans can be free, Hong Kongers can be free, and I hope you are here not just for Tibet, but for all the suppressed people around the world. And I thank you again for your presence at this conference, and I really look forward to hearing your presentations. And then, as an outcome of this, I really hope that the Tibetan agenda, the Uyghur agenda, and the Hong Kong agenda, the Taiwan agenda, will be in the forefront of the Universal Periodical Review next time around. Thank you so much.